Hi, this is Peter Schweizer. I'm a four-time #1 New York Times bestselling author, and I also have a podcast called The Drill Down, and I appreciate ZeroHedge hosting this event. We're going to have a discussion about something that happened 30 years ago, but is enormously relevant still today. And that, of course, is the Oklahoma City bombing that occurred in 1995. You had 168 Americans that were killed, 684 that were injured. And I had a discussion on my podcast about a week ago with an author, Margaret Roberts, who's written a terrific book called Blowback about the Oklahoma City bombing, what really happened, and her belief in how it relates to what the FBI and law enforcement is doing today. We're going to be joined by Margaret, and also on the panel is going to be Jesse Trentadue, who is a Salt Lake City-based trial attorney. He has been directly involved in investigating the Oklahoma City bombing for very personal reasons, and we are going to get to that. So I want to begin this segment, first of all, by asking you, Margaret, one of the central themes of your book is the Oklahoma City bombing was, in your words, manufactured terror, unquote. What exactly do you mean by that? How is it manufactured and why?
Hi, Peter. Great to be with you today. The question of manufactured terror, we think of terrorists acting by political ideology. Manufactured terror refers to federal law enforcement playing a role in the actions of the terrorists. And in this case, while it took some 20 years to actually find the solid evidence of this, there were markings all the way along of undercover operatives that played a role in the Oklahoma City bombing, which, as everyone remembers, was portrayed by the government as lone wolf terror by Timothy McVeigh, this disgruntled Iraq war soldier.
Now, is it your contention that this was intentional on the part of the FBI? In other words, they actually wanted the bombing to take place? Or is it your contention that this was incompetence, that they basically screwed up? They knew what was going on. They were pre-warned. They had knowledge, and they failed to act. What is your actual view of the intention of the FBI in this case?
Thanks for asking that, Peter. It's very important. I have no indication that the FBI intended this building to blow up. Rather, they were monitoring this neo-Nazi terror organization, of which Timothy McVeigh was an associate. There's also, no idea here that McVeigh was innocent. But what my investigation, which is led by Jesse Trentadue's work for 30 years, what my investigation turns up is that the government was monitoring this, and that the government was inciting this violence. That's really the key here, that there was a strategy to incite this group to commit violent acts. And then, of course, the intention was to stop them before the bomb went off, but something went sideways.
Well, I tell you, for the audience, Margaret's written a terrific book. She's also an experienced investigative journalist. So she does her research. She was the editorial director for America's Most Wanted, the program a lot of people are familiar with. Jesse, I want to bring you in on the conversation because you've been working on this issue. You got involved for a very personal reason. You had a brother who died in prison or in jail in Oklahoma City shortly after the bombing. It was deemed by the FBI to be suicide, but the medical examiner said it was not suicide, that he had been tortured, that this was, in his view, murder. How does that personal tragedy in your life relate to your involvement in investigating the Oklahoma City bombing?
Well, first of all, sir, it's nice to be here, but the medical examiner didn't say it was murder. He received extreme pressure from the FBI over years.
Okay.
So much so that the Oklahoma Attorney General's office had to intervene to try to protect him from the FBI. Now, my brother was beaten head to toe, skull smashed open in 3 places, throat cut. And the government of the United States says it was a suicidal hanging in a suicide-proof cell, and total silence. No one knew anything. And the FBI put that story out there. And I couldn't understand when he was murdered, and we had these horrific pictures, and the trauma was just incredible. At his funeral, we had an open casket, and I personally saw mourners go out in the parking lot and vomit after looking at his body. He was bleeding so badly. And I didn't start out to solve the Oklahoma City bombing. I didn't start out to attack the FBI or the government of the United States. I wanted justice for my brother. And so I took all the evidence I gathered over the years to the FBI, expecting them to help me, expecting them to do what they're supposed to do. Little did I know at the time that when I give them a witness's name, such as an inmate, the FBI would pass that information off to the guards who would tune that inmate up. And suddenly I would lose that witness. This happened time and time again. The surveillance videos in the SHU unit where he was, the special housing unit, the isolation cells, supposedly didn't work the cameras. The log books disappeared. Now these log books in a federal prison are like a log book on a naval ship. Once they're completed at the end of the year, they go to the National Archives. All the log books disappeared, and the ones who didn't disappear had the pages removed from the day my brother was there. And so you have it just reeks of a cover-up, and I don't understand why. And I keep fighting the FBI, and then I had early clues, and I'm jumping around here a bit. He was murdered in August of 95. In December or January of 95, or December 95 or January 96. And this is back before caller ID. I get a phone call from someone who says, wouldn't identify themselves, says your brother was killed by the FBI. It was an interrogation that went wrong. They suspected him of being a member of a bank robbery gang that was robbing banks to fund attacks against the government of the United States. I took all calls at that time, never knowing when a true clue or some evidence would come in. And I dismissed that. And then about 6 months later, I read an article in the LA Times about a Richard Lee Guthrie, who was a member of a bank robbery gang called the Aryan Republican Army, who supposedly hanged himself in his cell in federal custody the day before he was going to give what they described a tell-all interview to the LA Times about the Oklahoma City bombing, which he said would blow the lid off that crime. And I thought that was a coincidence. But it really came together to me from two sources. One was McVeigh himself. Just before he was executed, he sent me a message and he said, I saw your brother's photograph. I saw what they'd done to him. He said, it's my opinion your brother was tortured and killed by the FBI because they thought he was John Doe too. And that stunned me a bit. But where it really came together was about 2003 when I get a call from a reporter, J.D. Cash, of Eastern Oklahoma, the McCurtain County Gazette, I think was the paper. He did, I found out later, some masterful reporting on the Oklahoma City bombing. He was scooping all the major networks, all the major media on the stories he was finding. He was going door to door, knocking on doors, talking to witnesses. And so JD calls me up, and I'm in my office, and he says, introduced himself, and he said, you got a minute? I said, yes, Jay. He said, what do you need? He said, I'd like to talk to you about your brother. I said, fine. He said, how tall was your brother? I said, he's about 5'8". He said, what was his build? What was his build like? I said, he's a powerfully built man. Complexion, dark complexion. Where was he when he was arrested? I said, he was coming back across the border from Mexico, having visited his Hispanic wife's family. He's coming across from Tijuana to San Diego. And JD said, did he have any tattoos? And I said, yeah, he had a tattoo. And JD said, what kind and where? I said, he had a dragon tattoo on his left forearm. And you could hear the air exhale out of JD. He says, you better sit down. And I said, I am sitting down. He said, let me tell you this. He says, your brother was picked up at the height of the largest manhunt in American history for John Doe 2. Here's a description of John Doe 2. White male, 5'8", powerful upper body build, dark complected, believed to be in Canada or Mexico, driving brown Chevrolet pickup, my mid-1980s brown Chevrolet pickup truck, which is what my brother was driving at the time, and dragon tattoo left forearm. And so Kenneth is supposedly picked up for a parole violation, but his crimes have been committed in San Diego. The judge who sentenced him was in San Diego. His parole revocation hearing should have been in San Diego. I did not know that at the time, I do now. But suddenly he's sent to Oklahoma and he's dead 2 days later. And with that knowledge from JD, that's when I started my lawsuits against the federal government, a series of Freedom of Information Act suits to get evidence. God, I don't know how many, how have there been, Margaret?
Several.
There's still,
Four.
I've got one now that's been pending since 2008. So,
well, and I want to talk to you in a minute, Jesse, about the progress that you're making in those lawsuits, and I know you're getting a lot of resistance. But you mentioned a group, the Aryan Republican Army. Margaret mentions that group in her book, and Margaret describes this group, which was ostensibly centrally involved in a way in Oklahoma City, as a front group of the FBI. Explain that, and why do you think it's relevant to what unfolded in Oklahoma City, Margaret?
I will do that. For your audience, though, I think maybe since Jesse has just made this, is a grand connection in the investigation, there may be some of your audience that don't remember who John Doe 2 was. And it's so important because he's just been connected as the dead ringer lookalike to Kenneth Trentadue. And John Doe 2 was the passenger in the bomb truck with Timothy McVeigh as he delivered and detonated that devastating bomb. Then John Doe 2 simply vanished into thin air. And soon after, right around the time, in fact, that Kenneth Trentadue was arrested, soon the FBI began to back away from even the existence of John Doe 2. Claiming that it was all a mistake, this biggest manhunt in history, and that the eyewitnesses must have been mistaken. So we'll leave that there. To your question, Peter, about the Aryan Republican Army, is your question how they figure in the investigation, or how
yes,
they figure
and
as a
and the
front group?
ones that you mentioned them as they're essentially an FBI creation, or
Yes.
they were enhanced by the FBI. Explain the FBI connection to that group and why it's important to the larger story of Oklahoma City.
Yes, absolutely. And this really is the smoking gun of this investigation. And it came in 2011. So, well, after many years and many leads and many twists and turns in this investigation, Jesse received a phone call from a fellow Marine whose name was John Matthews, who told Jesse that he had been following Jesse's crusade for justice for Kenneth, and he wanted to tell him about Patcon. And he said, it's bigger and uglier than you know. So that led to John Matthews, whistleblower, and the FBI's top Patcon spy against right-wing extremists in the 1990s. That phone call led him to come forward, go to Salt Lake City, and tell Jesse his story. The smoking gun of John Matthews' story is that it's twofold. He said he believed that Patcon, that Oklahoma City was a Patcon operation, meaning it was an undercover FBI infiltration against this neo-Nazi terror group that was hiding out in a rural Oklahoma compound known as Elohim City. But John Matthews went further and told Jesse that it was his direct knowledge that Patcon was created by the FBI as a front group to incite violence, neo-Nazi violence, to carry out its intentions. That group wanted to foment an insurrection against the United States government. They were robbing banks to raise money to do so. They robbed 22 banks across the Midwest, and their haul was $250,000. So multiply that by 2 in today's money. And from that, none of that money was ever recovered by the FBI. And according to its leader, Richard Lee Guthrie, the lookalike of Trentadue, they donated it largely and generously to white power causes.
Interesting. So, Jesse, I want you to tell us a little bit more about this Patcon program, but I also want to ask you specifically about one of the FOIA lawsuits you've been fighting to try to get the government to release the surveillance video footage of the Murrah building in Oklahoma City. It's shocking to me. I guess I'd forgotten this. They have surveillance video footage apparently of the federal building, and that video footage has never been released. You've been fighting that for how long? And what does the government say when you're trying to get a hold of this footage?
I've been fighting to get that tape. Well, first of all, the FBI's own records say, and I'm quoting from memory, surveillance video shows the bomb detonating 3 minutes and 6 seconds after the suspects exit the truck. Pretty clear. They have a videotape that shows, in fact, it even describes the truck being driven to the Murrah building and parked, and gives that description, 3 minutes and 6 seconds after the suspects exit. Well, there wasn't supposed to be suspects. It's supposed to be only Timothy McVeigh in that truck. There was nobody else supposed to be in there with him. I filed that lawsuit to get that tape in 2008. It's still going on. The FBI claims they can't find it. Now, you would think if you had a videotape showing who committed this horrific crime, wouldn't that have been exhibit number 1 in McVeigh's criminal trial? And the reason it wasn't, because I believe that second person was an FBI operative who got out of that truck. Now, I'm not saying he intended to blow the building up. Maybe his objective was to disarm the bomb. But I believe that's the only reason you would not produce that tape. And they can't claim the tape doesn't exist, because I also uncovered records where 2 rogue agents in the Los Angeles field office of the FBI in 1996 were trying to sell that copy of that tape to NBC Dateline, I think, for $1 million. I mean, they've sold their own records. So that, I mean, they're trying to give a black market copy of that tape to the media. And about Matthews, and I hope it doesn't sound disjointed. When you ask, to come back to a question you asked Margaret about, did they intend Oklahoma City, the FBI? I don't know if we'll ever know that. We know they knew 6 months in advance it was going to happen. They don't stop it. They had informants embedded in the gang that was carrying out this attack, and they don't stop it. And Matthews told me that while he believed Oklahoma City was a Patcon operation, Patcon also had 2 other Oklahoma City type operations in play at the same time to blow up federal buildings with a truck bomb. Now they stopped the other 2. They don't stop Oklahoma City. Now you answer the question for me. Why? Was it a screw up, or did they want it to happen? Either way, you'll get a massive cover-up to come out of that. And as for the ARA, Matthews told me the ARA was a front. It was set up by the FBI. They were monitoring these groups. And one of the things that they were doing is they know who these bank robbers are, and they don't stop them. And it turns out that what they're doing is they're following the money. They want to know to whom, to what other groups are these people funneling money. So you put all these people in these banks, these 22 or 23 banks, when these armed robbers come in with bombs, at risk, terrified, just so you can see where that robbery money goes. And it's insane. It's a squirrel-brained idea, this notion of Patcon to incite these people to infiltrate, and just let it go too far. I mean, if you got a plot to blow up a building, you don't have to let them go far down the road. You just won't. It's conspiracy to arrest them. Why let them take it all the way across the goal line? It's what the FBI did time and time again. And Matthew said he joined voluntarily into Patcon because he thought these groups were a danger and a threat to his country. He was told his objective was to infiltrate and report on them. But then as he got further and further down the road, and it was almost 10 years, as Margaret said, he realized that the real objective was to incite them. Yeah. And he called me and said, I'll come over. And he said, this is so big, so ugly, you won't believe it. And how he contacted me was I would put, for my own protection, all these documents I got from the FBI, I would put out on the internet. And he came across them. And I did that for two reasons. I did for my own protection and then also to make sure that it was out there for somebody else could use it. He had discovered those documents. And he called me up and he said, well, you've got all the pieces, but you haven't put it together. And I said, what the hell do you mean? He says, Patcon. He said, I'll come over and tell you about it. And so I remember clearly it was July 24th, 2011, because that's in Utah, that's the biggest holiday in the state. That's when the Mormon pioneers arrived in the Salt Lake Valley in 1847. Everything shuts down. Courts, big parade. It's bigger than the 4th of July. So we're sitting out in front of my office and found out we're both former Marines, 3rd Marine Division. And he told me why he went into Patcon and how disillusioned he was. He told me he was very sick and ill from Agent Orange poison. He didn't know how long he was going to live. And he wanted this story told before he died. And I said, well, John, I said, he went through it. I mean, Patcon goes beyond Oklahoma City. It was Waco. It was I don't know if you recall, the Fast and Furious operation in Phoenix. Matthews was involved in that. There was a plan to blow up the cooling system of the Browns Ferry nuclear plant in Alabama. Matthews was there. At the same time Waco was going on, they had a plan to take down another religious community in Benton, Tennessee, which was called off because Waco turned out so badly. Matthews is rattling off 8 years of all of this stuff. And so I said to him, listen, John, I have a friend, John Solomon, who was the bureau chief till he retired of AP in Washington. He's with Newsweek magazine. Let me get a hold of you. So I got him and I introduced both Johns to John. And John Solomon assigned a reporter to do the story for Newsweek. It was supposed to run the last Monday in November of 2011. I get a call about a week or so before, and the reporter who wrote the story was reading it to me over the phone. I didn't have a copy. And it was a story that Matthews wanted told. It was Oklahoma City. It was the ARA. It was Waco. It was a Lone Wolf gun store. It was the Browns Ferry nuclear plant. It was the whole Patcon mess. And of course, when the story comes out, none of it's there. I asked John, and John is furious. John says to me, he said, I knew it was a risk for me to do this because those people are still out there. Yeah. And they'll come back for me. And he said, but I was willing to take that risk to have this story told. He said, all they've done now is kill me, is draw a big bullseye on me because they've told all of these people out there that for 8 years, I was among them, reporting on them. And so he was just outraged. And apparently, Matthews told me that he found out from the reporter that a delegation from the Justice Department had gone to see the owners I guess, of Newsweek, and they had killed that story.
Yeah.
And that's when he
Yeah.
agreed to be a witness for me in my trial that took place in 2014. But
Yeah.
John Matthews is a very brave man. He's going underground, obviously, now, and for good reason. But he told horror stories about what they had done under
So
the guise of protecting Americans.
let me just build on that, because I think that that's a really important point, and I think it's something that Margaret hinted in the earlier conversation we had, which is a lot of this may seem like history. It happened 30 years ago, but if you look at some of the other issues that have come up, January 6th, for example, some of the instances involving the alleged bombs that were being set in Washington, D.C., there is this veil or these concerns that there were infiltrations of a lot of these actions. So, Margaret, it seems to me that what happened in Oklahoma City, and I think you've been very judicious in saying we don't know the motives, we need more transparency, but that mode of behavior continues to occur with the FBI. Do you see that pattern existing, and that what John Matthews says he was involved in is still happening today in a lot of these confrontations that are occurring?
Well, Peter, I think certainly that is what the pattern suggests. And the failure to identify what happened here and hold people accountable has only made it easier to continue this pattern of behavior from Oklahoma to perhaps the Boston bombing, where there were, suspicions on Capitol Hill that the older Sarnoff brother may have been an FBI informant. And then we have the Gretchen Whitmer kidnap plot that has completely fallen apart and exposed a case in which there were just as many FBI operatives as there were perpetrators. And on to January 6th, where it has taken 5 years to ferret out the number 26 undercover assets who were at the Capitol on January 6th. And still we have Senator Grassley with a letter on the Inspector General's desk demanding to know what other agency affiliated assets were on the ground that day. And now we're in year 6 from that. So yes, I think it reaches the level of an intelligence crisis, what we have going on here.
Yeah, it really demands a lot more transparency. I think we would probably all agree that there is a need from time to time for counterintelligence operations, but clearly we have a lot of evidence that they have gone awry. Just final thoughts here. Unfortunately, I have a commitment, but I want to get final thoughts first from you, Jesse. Give me 2 specific things. If you were sitting with the Attorney General Pam Bondi right now, and you could have 2 specific requests of either information you wanted to release or action taken, what would it be?
Release the videotape of the bombing and unseal John Matthews' deposition, because the Department of Justice has it sealed, and President Trump's Department of Justice is fighting to keep it sealed. It would. He talks about all their operations, most of them.
Those are 2 very great specific things. ZeroHedge, of course, has a huge and influential audience. Let's make sure that those 2 messages are delivered to Pam Bondi. Margaret, the same question for you. Maybe they're the same, maybe they're slightly different. What are the 2 things you would request of this Attorney General to give greater transparency to what actually happened in Oklahoma City?
I think I would add to Jesse's list. I mean, those are the 2 critical calls to action. And Jesse has a letter on Attorney General Bondi's desk since March, asking the Justice Department to stand down from its opposition to unsealing the John Matthews deposition. The other area here that needs addressing is the FOIA process. Jesse Trentadue because he's a lawyer as well as the brother of a murdered prisoner, has fought this FOIA battle that led him into the Oklahoma City bombing mystery for all these years, and proven along the way just how flawed the actual reality of FOIA, that is our Freedom of Information Act. This is supposed to be the citizens' last resort for obtaining records that belong to the American public. This story belongs to the public, not locked away in secret government vaults. And yet, the many exclusions available to the secret keepers inside these government agencies make it almost impossible. Jesse has navigated this flawed process so masterfully, and yet this action, this FOIA action to release the videotapes has just been sitting marooned for more than a decade while a special master investigates witness tampering charges. To return to John Matthews, the reason he pulled out of the trial on the eve of testifying, he told Jesse that he had been pressured by the FBI not to tell his story, not to expose, which would have exposed Patcon. And so the surveillance videotapes case, which is fully litigated, has sat for 10 long years with no finding. So FOIA needs to be fixed. And that's the call to action that I would add to Jesse's excellent list.
I think that's a tremendous suggestion. As somebody once told me, when it comes to the Freedom of Information Act, there's not a lot of freedom and there's not a lot of information that comes out of it. And that needs to change. We should have a longer conversation about this. I apologize. It's a time constraint that I have. I would encourage everybody to please pick up Margaret's book, Blowback. It's terrific. It's been out a couple of weeks. It is climbing the charts in terms of sales. It's real granular investigative journalism. Jesse played a big role in the information that is in that book. So it's not opinion, it's fact-based. And what I love about what both of you are doing is your drive and your desire here is for transparency. You have a lot of answers. You don't pretend to have all of them. It's transparency. The American people need to know fully what happened 30 years ago. Thank you all for joining us, for taking the time to listen. I thank you for ZeroHedge for giving us the platform to have this conversation. Please send our comments, put the comments on ZeroHedge, and we hope to do this again real soon again. Thanks again for paying attention.
Thank you.